Elvis Presley spent August 12, 1958, doing what soldiers do when they are waiting for bad news: small, useless tasks. He was at Fort Hood, Texas, 2 weeks into a leave that had nothing scheduled, and he kept walking out to the driveway of the rented house on Oak Hill Drive to check whether a car had pulled up. His father, Vernon, had flown to Memphis 2 days earlier. His mother, Gladys, had been admitted to Methodist Hospital with what doctors were calling hepatitis, though her color and her swelling told a less containable story. Elvis had asked his commanding officer for emergency leave once already that month, and he asked again that afternoon, and this time the answer was yes before he finished the sentence. Gladys Presley was 46 years old. She had been drinking on and off for at least 2 years, mixing it badly with diet pills a doctor in Memphis had prescribed her to manage weight that had crept up since the family's move into money. She did not like Graceland, not really. She had grown up poor in Mississippi, picking cotton as a child, and she found herself in 1957 in a mansion with a swimming pool, with reporters parked outside the gate and a son who couldn't walk to a drugstore without being mobbed, and the size of it frightened her more than it ever pleased her. Friends who visited in those last 2 years describe a woman who kept a flock of chickens in the side yard of a Memphis mansion because she wanted something around her that needed feeding the old way, something that didn't have a publicist. Elvis flew home and was at her bedside within hours of his leave being approved. Hospital staff that week remembered him sitting in a straight-back chair, pulled close enough that his knee touched the bed frame, for hours not performing for anyone, because there was no one there to perform for except his mother, who was failing. What happened in that hospital room on the night of August 13th and into the morning of August 14th has been told and retold by people who weren't in it, which is part of why it's worth being honest here about what is actually known and what isn't. There is no audio recording. There is no transcript. Whatever was said between Elvis and his mother in her final conscious hours exists only in the memory of the people present, filtered afterward through grief, through decades of retelling, and in some cases through other people's incentive to have a good story to sell. Vernon Presley gave a few interviews in later years that touched on it. Dee Presley, who married Vernon after Gladys died and who was not present that week, repeated secondhand accounts in her own later book. None of it should be treated as a transcript. What follows is built from the more carefully sourced pieces. Biographer Peter Guralnick's interviews with people who were actually in Memphis that week, and the hospital and funeral home records that survive. And where the record runs out, it says so. To understand what that bedside conversation meant, you have to go back to what Gladys and Elvis were to each other before any of this, because the strangeness of the ending only makes sense against the strangeness of the beginning. Gladys Love Smith was born in 1912 in Mississippi, the second of 8 children in a family with almost nothing. She married Vernon Presley in 1933 when she was 21 and he was 17. A marriage so quietly scandalous in their small farming town that Vernon lied about his age on the license. Their first child was a daughter, born and lost. Then, on January 8, 1935, in a 2-room shotgun house in East Tupelo that Vernon had built mostly himself, Gladys gave birth to twin boys. The first, Jesse Guerin, was stillborn. The second, born 35 minutes later, lived, and they named him Elvis Aaron. A surviving twin changes a mother in ways that are hard to overstate and easy to sentimentalize, so it's worth being specific instead of vague about it. Gladys did not simply love her son more because of the loss. She watched him constantly. Neighbors in Tupelo remembered her, walking him to school every day well past the age other mothers stopped, standing at the fence during recess to make sure nothing happened to him. When the family moved to Memphis in 1948, fleeing a check kiting charge against Vernon and looking for work, that closeness didn't loosen. It tightened, because now there was a city around them instead of a small town where everyone already knew whose boy he was. Elvis called her Satinin. a nickname whose origin nobody has ever fully nailed down. Some who knew the family thought it came from a local radio comedy character. Others thought Elvis just made the sound up as a child, and it stuck. He called her on the road, often daily, when he started touring in 1955. Scotty Moore and Bill Black, who played guitar and bass behind him on those early dates, later described a teenager who would find a payphone in whatever small town they'd landed in and call Memphis before he did anything else, including eat. When fame hit hard in 1956, the Dorsey Brothers show, then Milton Berle, then Ed Sullivan, then a level of attention that had no precedent in American popular culture, Elvis's response was to buy his parents a house. Not a mansion at first, a modest brick ranch on Audubon Drive. Then, when the crowds outside that house got to be too much, Graceland itself in 1957, a colonial-style mansion on what was then the edge of Memphis, bought partly because it had enough land that fans couldn't press their faces against the windows. Gladys never adjusted to any of it. She had grown up working land with her hands, and she ended up the mother of the most photographed young man in America, unable to go to the grocery store without being trailed. Several of the people closest to the family in this period, including Elvis's road manager Lamar Fike, later said that what aged Gladys fastest wasn't the alcohol on its own. It was the isolation that drinking grew out of. She was a rural Mississippi woman set down inside a fishbowl, and the fishbowl is what she was drinking against. Then, in March 1958, the United States Army drafted Elvis. His manager, Colonel Tom Parker, could have pulled strings to get him into special services, performing for troops instead of serving as an ordinary soldier, and there's evidence Parker considered it. Elvis turned it down. Whatever else can be said about the calculation behind that decision. And Parker clearly understood the public relations value of the king peeling potatoes. Like everyone else, Elvis himself seems to have wanted, at least partly, to actually be a soldier. He reported to the induction center in Memphis on March 24, 1958, was sworn in, had his head shaved on camera in a moment that made front pages worldwide, and was assigned to Fort Hood, Texas, for basic training. Gladys did not handle the separation well. People around her at the time describe a deterioration that tracked almost exactly with the distance between them. She had survived Elvis becoming the most famous young man in the world. She did not survive him becoming, even temporarily, an ordinary private stationed 500 miles from home. In June 1958, Elvis was permitted to rent a house off base in Killeen, Texas, so his parents could live near him during training, a privilege almost no other private would have gotten, arranged through Parker's relentless lobbying of the Army's Public Affairs Office, which understood that a contented Elvis made for better headlines than a miserable one. Vernon and Gladys moved into the rented house on Oak Hill Drive that summer. For a few weeks, it looked like it might steady her. Then, her health broke. By early August, she was too sick to hide it from the people around her, which for Gladys Presley was unusual, because she had spent 2 years hiding it from almost everyone, including, as far as anyone could tell, herself. Vernon got her on a train back to Memphis. She refused to fly, afraid of crashing, and checked her into Methodist Hospital on August 8th. Within days, her liver was visibly failing. The diagnosis on the chart said hepatitis. People who saw her in that hospital bed, including Elvis once he arrived, understood that something more was happening, something that had been building for longer than a single illness usually takes. Elvis reached Memphis on August 12th, after the second emergency leave request was approved, and from that point until the early hours of August 14th, he was at the hospital almost continuously. Lamar Fike, who was there, later told Peter Guralnick that Elvis barely left the room, that he sat holding his mother's hand for stretches of time with nothing performed about it, no audience, nobody watching except his father, and a rotating handful of relatives and hospital staff. What was said in that room across those final hours is the part that has generated the most speculation and the least reliable documentation, and it's worth pausing on why. Gladys's condition worsened through the night of August 13th. By the early hours of August 14th, she had slipped in and out of consciousness. The people in the room were exhausted, frightened, and not taking notes. Grief reorganizes memory. People who were present that night gave somewhat different accounts of it even decades later, not because anyone was necessarily lying, but because that is what trauma does to recollection. What the more carefully sourced accounts agree on, broadly, is this. At some point in those final conscious exchanges, Elvis leaned close to his mother and told her he loved her. Not a single line delivered once, but something repeated, in the way people repeat things to someone who may not be able to hold on to a sentence for very long. Several accounts describe him calling her Satnin in that room, the childhood name surfacing the way old names do at deathbeds, when the adult version of a relationship falls away and what's left is the oldest layer of it. There are accounts, less consistently corroborated, that describe him promising her things, that he'd take care of his father, that he wasn't going to let what was happening to the family change who he was. None of this rises to the level of a verified quotation, and anyone who tells you they know the exact words Elvis Presley whispered to his dying mother is reconstructing, consciously or not, rather than reporting. What is solidly documented is the outcome. Gladys Presley died at 3:15 in the morning on August 14, 1958, of what the death certificate listed as hepatitis, though the underlying contributors, alcohol, amphetamine-based diet medication, and a heart weakened by both, were understood by people close to the family even if they weren't named on the paperwork in 1958, in an era when such things were rarely named on paperwork. Elvis was in the room. By multiple accounts, he had to be physically restrained from climbing into the hospital bed beside her body. He kept saying, according to people present, some version of the same phrase, that everything he had was because of her, that none of it meant anything without her. Though again, the exact phrasing varies depending on who's telling it and how many years had passed since they'd told it last. The days that followed are better documented because there were photographers outside the funeral home and reporters with notebooks, and grief performed in public leaves a more reliable record than grief whispered in private. The funeral was held at Memphis Funeral Home on August 15th, with burial afterward at Forest Hill Cemetery. Photographs from that day show Elvis in a dark suit, visibly unsteady, supported at points by Vernon and by his cousin, Gene Smith. He had not slept in the days since his mother's death. He stood over the open casket for long stretches before the service, and witnesses described him talking to her, not performing grief for the cameras outside, who couldn't see into the room, but speaking quietly to a body that could no longer answer. The conversation that hadn't finished in the hospital trying, uselessly, to continue. Nick Adams, an actor and friend who had flown in for the funeral, later said Elvis kept repeating that his mother was his best friend, that whatever happened to him from here on, the person it was all supposed to matter to was gone. Reporters who covered the burial described a kind of grief that didn't fit comfortably into a press story, too raw, too undignified by the standards of how grief was supposed to look in 1958. A young man who at one point had to be pulled bodily away from the casket. Vernon Presley, asked by a reporter in the days afterward how he was holding up, reportedly said almost nothing, only that he didn't know how either of them, meaning himself and his son, were going to go on without her. Elvis returned to Fort Hood 10 days later and finished his training. He shipped out for West Germany that October, beginning the period of his life that would later be remembered, somewhat misleadingly, as a kind of patriotic interlude. The king doing his duty, dating starlets in his off hours, meeting a teenage Priscilla Beaulieu at a party in Bad Nauheim. Underneath that public sequence of events was a 23-year-old man who, by the accounts of people who served alongside him, never fully recovered his footing after his mother's death. He kept a framed photograph of her on his nightstand in Germany. He wrote to Gladys's grave, according to people close to him, in the sense that he visited it whenever he was in Memphis for the rest of his life, sometimes alone, sometimes late at night, long after the original mourners had stopped coming. The years that followed give some shape to how deep the loss actually went, because grief that doesn't fully resolve tends to show up sideways, in patterns rather than statements. Elvis's later well-documented dependence on prescription medication has been traced by several biographers, including Guralnick, partly to this period, not as a single clean cause, since there were other contributors, including the demands of an unrelenting performance schedule and a personal physician, Dr. George Nicopolis, who prescribed with little restraint for 2 decades. But the specific drugs involved in 1958 and the specific pattern of using medication to manage an unmanageable interior state echo what Gladys herself had been doing in the 2 years before her death almost exactly. People who knew both of them well, including longtime friend Marty Lacker, observed this resemblance at the time and found it hard to watch. Elvis kept Gladys's room at Graceland largely as she'd left it for years. He referred to her in interviews sparingly, and when he did, the sentences tended to be short and flat in a way that read, to people who watched him give hundreds of other interviews full of charm and deflection, as a kind of guardedness he didn't extend to any other subject. Asked once by a reporter what he missed most, he said simply that he missed having someone who didn't want anything from him. It's one of the few direct quotations from Elvis about his mother that exists in a verifiable interview transcript, and it carries more than most of the unverifiable hospital room lines that have circulated since, because it's actually his on the record, in his own words. He was 23 when she died, and 42 when he died himself, in August of 1977, 19 years and a few days apart, almost to the date. Both Augusts, both in Memphis, a coincidence that biographers have noted without being able to make much more of it than a coincidence. He is buried beside her at Graceland, where Vernon had both bodies moved in 1977 after a foiled attempt to steal Elvis's body from Forest Hill Cemetery made the family decide the meditation garden on the estate grounds would be safer. What was actually whispered in that hospital room in the early hours of August 14, 1958, will never be fully recoverable. And that's a more honest place to end than inventing a tidy final line and presenting it as fact. What's recoverable is everything around it. A 23-year-old who had become, within 2.5 years, more famous than almost anyone in the history of American entertainment, sitting in a metal folding chair beside a woman who had raised him in a 2-room house in Tupelo and never stopped being afraid for him, watching her die of something that had been quietly killing her since the moment his life outgrew the life she understood. Whatever he said to her, he meant it the way people mean things they will spend the rest of their lives trying and failing to live up to.